In October 1967, a man stood before a Bolivian firing squad. His hands were bound, his body battered, yet witnesses recall his final words with eerie precision: "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Within minutes, Ernesto Che Guevara was dead, a doctor-turned-revolutionary whose image would outlive him by generations. But how does a man born into comfort in Argentina, trained to save lives as a physician, end up orchestrating firing squads, commanding guerrilla armies, and dying in a remote Andean schoolhouse? What makes a human being embrace both the scalpel and the rifle? This is not just the story of Che Guevara, the T-shirt icon. It is the story of Guevara, the strategist, the ideologue, and the executioner, a figure loved and loathed in equal measure. His life raises questions of justice, violence, and sacrifice that still echo today. Stay with us, because before this story ends, you will see how a man who ordered the execution of hundreds became a martyr for millions, and how one single photograph turned his brutal life and death into an immortal symbol. If you want evidence-driven history told with this level of depth, support Tale of History by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below. Because the story you are about to hear will reveal the doctor who healed with one hand, and killed with the other. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on the 14th of June, 1928, in the city of Rosario, Argentina. His family background combined both privilege and turbulence. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, came from an aristocratic lineage that had faded in fortune, while his mother, Celia de la Serna, descended from Irish immigrants and carried with her a fiercely independent spirit. Together, they represented a family of modest means but deep intellectual curiosity. From birth, Che, as he would later be called, carried burdens that would shape his character. Chronic asthma plagued him throughout his life. The attacks often left him gasping for breath, bedridden for days at a time. Yet the illness never deterred him from physical exertion. If anything, it hardened his willpower. As a boy, he forced himself into sports, particularly rugby, where his determination and aggressive play astonished peers who knew of his fragile lungs. This contradiction, a weak body yoked to a ferocious spirit, would echo through the decades to come. The Guevara household brimmed with books. Shelves sagged under the weight of literature, history, and political tracts. Che consumed them with extraordinary appetite. As a teenager, he was already reading Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and the Cuban poet José Martí, whose writings on independence and justice stirred Latin American readers. He also found fascination in the works of Walt Whitman, Jack London, and H. G. Wells. It was a cosmopolitan mix, pairing revolutionary theory with philosophical inquiry and imaginative literature. Through those pages, young Ernesto developed a worldview that linked personal struggle to grand social battles. The family home was also politically engaged. Veterans of the Spanish Civil War, particularly those who had fought for the Republican cause, often visited. Conversations around the dinner table ranged from literature to socialism, from poetry to politics. These encounters impressed upon Che that ideas were not abstractions, they shaped destinies, toppled regimes, and demanded loyalty. By 1948, Ernesto had enrolled at the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. His initial goal was straightforward, to become a physician specializing in dermatology. Yet his intellectual hunger kept pulling him beyond the lecture hall. He saw medicine not only as a profession but as a tool to relieve suffering. His notes from this time suggest a budding compassion for the marginalized, but also frustration with the limits of individual treatment. It was during his university years that Ernesto began long journeys that would transform him. In 1950, he set out on a solo tour of northern Argentina by bicycle fitted with a small motor. 2 years later, he embarked on a far more ambitious expedition. Alongside his friend Alberto Granado, he mounted a sputtering motorcycle they nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One. Their route would cover more than 8,000 kilometers across South America. This journey became immortalized in his later published motorcycle diaries. The notes are not romanticized travel sketches but direct observations of injustice. He wrote of miners in Chile laboring in dangerous conditions for meager wages, of indigenous Peruvians marginalized in their own land, and of vast inequalities carved by imperial influence. The trip exposed him to realities no classroom could teach. One of the most pivotal episodes occurred at a leper colony on the banks of the Amazon in Peru. There, Guevara and Granado volunteered as medical assistants. Patients afflicted with leprosy lived segregated, treated as pariahs. But Che refused to wear gloves when shaking their hands. He insisted on sharing meals, swimming in the river with them, treating them as equals. His diary records that these men and women, cast out by society, embodied a humanity far stronger than the elites he had encountered in capital cities. It was a moral turning point. Through these experiences, Ernesto began to believe that the root causes of disease and poverty could not be treated solely by medicine. Illness, he concluded, was often the symptom of deeper structural injustice. If miners coughed blood because of unsafe shafts, if children starved while plantations exported crops abroad, then the cure was not a stethoscope but systemic change. By 1953, Guevara had completed his medical degree. He was now a doctor, but the profession no longer satisfied him. He could have pursued a comfortable practice in Buenos Aires, far from the dust of rural roads. Instead, he packed his bags once again and set out across Latin America, seeking not patients but causes. His first stops were in Bolivia and Peru, where he observed attempts at land reform and popular mobilization. Yet in both places he found frustration. The movements were fragmented, the governments timid, the people hesitant to embrace revolution. Still restless, he pressed onward. The real crucible came in Guatemala. The nation had just embarked on a bold experiment. President Jacobo Arbenz, elected in 1951, had launched sweeping reforms aimed at redistributing land to peasant farmers. Much of that land had long been held idle by foreign corporations, particularly the powerful United Fruit Company of the United States. For Guevara, Guatemala seemed to offer the model of transformation he had been seeking, a government daring to confront entrenched power and foreign exploitation. But history would prove brutal. In 1954, the CIA launched a covert operation to overthrow Arbenz, citing communist influence and threatening U.S. interests. The coup shattered the democratic revolution. Tanks rolled, planes bombed, and the fragile dream collapsed. For Ernesto Guevara, the events of Guatemala marked the point of no return. The streets of Guatemala would teach him a lesson no medical school ever could, that democratic reform could be bombed out of existence. And from that moment, Ernesto Guevara began to believe that only armed struggle could cure the sickness of his continent. When Ernesto Guevara arrived in Guatemala in late 1953, he believed he had found a living laboratory of reform. President Jacobo Arbenz, elected 2 years earlier, had begun to implement bold land redistribution policies. The idea was simple yet radical. Unused estates owned by corporations such as the United Fruit Company would be broken up and distributed to poor farmers. For Guevara, it was the embodiment of social justice. A government using law, not revolution, to address deep inequalities. He mingled with student groups, left-wing intellectuals, and civil servants inspired by Arbenz's program. In his letters, he spoke of Guatemala as proof that Latin America could transform itself peacefully. But the optimism was short-lived. To Washington, land reform was not a domestic policy but a threat. United Fruit lobbied U.S. officials, claiming communist infiltration. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated Operation Success, a covert campaign of psychological warfare, sabotage, and paramilitary force. Planes dropped leaflets and bombs, spreading panic. Radio broadcasts fabricated reports of rebel advances. In June, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas marched across the border with a small U.S.-backed force. Within weeks, the Arbenz government collapsed. The impact on Guevara was profound. He joined a militia to defend the government, but the defense crumbled. When the coup succeeded, he sought refuge in the Argentine embassy. Watching from hiding, he concluded that the experiment in Guatemala had failed not because its people lacked courage, but because democratic reform without armed defense was doomed. Imperial power, he believed, would always crush gradual change. From this moment forward, Guevara's conviction hardened: true revolution required force. By late 1954, disillusioned but radicalized, he traveled to Mexico. There, he survived by practicing medicine, treating some of the city's poorest residents. Yet in cafes and political circles he also found a community of Latin American exiles, survivors of failed uprisings, opponents of dictatorships, and refugees from U.S. intervention. Mexico City had become a hub where revolutionaries gathered to share plans, argue strategies, and forge alliances. Among those exiles were Cubans plotting to overthrow the military regime of Fulgencio Batista. Batista had seized power in Havana in a 1952 coup and ruled with corruption and brutality. To many in the region, he symbolized the decay of a state beholden to foreign business and organized crime. For Guevara, the Cuban cause seemed not only just but also practical. Here was a dictatorship vulnerable to armed challenge, unlike the coup-proof militaries he had seen in Argentina and Guatemala. In July 1955, Ernesto Guevara was introduced to Fidel Castro, a young lawyer from eastern Cuba who had led an unsuccessful assault on the Moncada barracks 2 years earlier. Accounts of their first meeting suggest a conversation that stretched late into the night. Fidel outlined his plan: to sail from Mexico to Cuba with a small band of fighters, land on the island, and begin a guerrilla war in the mountains. For Guevara, Castro's determination mirrored his own belief that only direct struggle could defeat imperialism and dictatorship. Guevara did not hesitate. He agreed to join not as a doctor, but as a combatant. His medical skills were valuable, but his ambition was larger: to be at the center of armed transformation. Training soon followed. Alongside a small cadre of Cuban exiles, he learned guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, and survival in hostile terrain. He proved disciplined, resilient, and uncompromising, earning respect within the group. The decisive step came in late 1956. 82 men boarded an aging yacht called the Granma and set sail from Mexico. The plan was audacious: land on Cuba's southeastern coast, march to the Sierra Maestra mountains, and spark a nationwide uprising. Guevara was among them, now fully committed to the role of revolutionary fighter. But the landing turned into catastrophe. Delayed by rough seas, the expedition arrived late and was spotted by Batista's forces. As they struggled ashore through swamps, the rebels were ambushed. In the chaos, most of the men were killed or captured. Out of the original 82, barely a dozen managed to escape into the hills. Among them were Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and Ernesto Guevara. This failure could easily have ended the Cuban project. Instead, it became its crucible. Hidden in the Sierra Maestra, this small surviving band began the long process of building a guerrilla army. And it was here that Guevara's transformation into a legendary figure truly began. History often turns on moments like Guatemala in 1954, when one nation's democratic dream was crushed by foreign power. If you want Tale of History to keep bringing you evidence-driven accounts of these turning points, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Do reforms fail without force? We want to hear your perspective. From a disastrous landing in Cuban swamps, only a handful survived. But in those mountains, through hunger and danger, they would begin a campaign that toppled a regime. And at the center of it stood a doctor-turned-commander named Ernesto Guevara. The swampy landing of the Granma had reduced the band of 82 men to fewer than a dozen survivors. Yet those who made it into the Sierra Maestra mountains carried with them the seed of revolution. Among them was Ernesto Che Guevara, no longer just a doctor on the move, but a fighter determined to carve out a new order. The Sierra Maestra, a rugged chain of forests and valleys in eastern Cuba, became both refuge and crucible. Cut off from the lowlands, hunted by Batista's troops, the survivors learned to live by stealth and discipline. Food was scarce, weapons scarcer. But Guevara distinguished himself quickly. He tended to the wounded, improvising medical treatments with the scant supplies they carried. At the same time, he joined patrols, studied ambush tactics, and proved ruthless in enforcing discipline. Within months, the group began to attract peasants disillusioned with Batista's soldiers, who often burned villages or extorted farmers. The guerrillas positioned themselves as defenders of the poor. Guevara played multiple roles: doctor, teacher, and organizer. He established makeshift clinics, literacy programs, and even workshops to produce grenades. He also helped set up Radio Rebelde, a clandestine station broadcasting the rebels' message across Cuba. But alongside the humanitarian efforts came uncompromising severity. Guevara personally oversaw the execution of suspected informants, deserters, and peasants accused of aiding the army. To him, betrayal endangered the revolution itself. Later, in his writings, he would insist such measures were necessary to protect the cause. Supporters described him as principled, critics saw him as ruthless. By 1957, the guerrilla band had grown from a handful to hundreds. Small victories against Batista's patrols spread their reputation. Every successful ambush brought new recruits, while the army's brutality alienated the countryside. Guevara commanded his own column, where he demanded discipline, austerity, and loyalty. His asthma flared under the mountain climate, but he refused to let weakness excuse failure. Through 1958, the war intensified. Batista's army launched Operation Verano, deploying tens of thousands of troops in an effort to encircle and destroy the rebels. But the soldiers were poorly trained conscripts with low morale. By contrast, Castro's fighters used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run ambushes, sabotage, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Guevara's column excelled in these engagements, often striking supply lines and vanishing before reinforcements could respond. The turning point came late in 1958, as Batista's regime crumbled under corruption, desertions, and the growing strength of the rebellion. Guevara was given command of Column 8, tasked with a daring objective: march westward, hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory, and cut the island in half by seizing the city of Santa Clara. The march itself tested the endurance of his men. Crossing swamps, avoiding ambushes, and carrying limited supplies, they pressed on. Guevara demanded obedience, punishing infractions but also sharing the hardships. His leadership style blended severity with example. He carried his own pack, shared meager rations, and marched despite chronic asthma attacks. By December, Column 8 approached Santa Clara, a strategic city in central Cuba. Batista's forces held it with nearly 4,000 soldiers, while Guevara commanded barely 340. The odds seemed hopeless. Yet what followed would seal his reputation. On December 29, Guevara's men attacked the city. One of the boldest moves was to target an armored train sent by Batista to reinforce the garrison. The train carried troops, ammunition, and heavy weapons, enough to crush the rebel assault. Guevara ordered his men to tear up the tracks with bulldozers and derail the cars. In the ensuing chaos, rebels swarmed the immobilized train, capturing its cargo and demoralizing the defenders. With the train seized, thousands of government troops lost the will to fight. Many surrendered outright, others melted away. By nightfall, Santa Clara belonged to the rebels. It was the decisive victory of the war. The capture of the city not only split Cuba geographically but also broke Batista's final hope of holding power. News of the fall of Santa Clara spread rapidly. In Havana, Batista realized the end was near. At dawn on January 1, 1959, he fled the island, taking with him a fortune estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. As he boarded his plane, the Cuba he left behind was collapsing. For Guevara, the triumph was bittersweet. He had risen from a traveling doctor to a commander whose strategies toppled an army. He had brought clinics and literacy lessons to peasants but also bullets to suspected enemies. In Santa Clara, heroism and ruthlessness stood side by side, a contradiction that would define his legacy. From a band of survivors hiding in the mountains to the capture of a city defended by thousands, this is the kind of history that shows how the impossible becomes reality. If you value deep, evidence-driven storytelling, support Tale of History by subscribing now and sharing your thoughts below. Batista was gone. The rebels had won. But revolutionaries who seize power face a new challenge: how to govern. And for Che Guevara, the doctor-commander, that meant trading the mountains for the fortress of La Cabana, and the firing squads within its walls. When the rebels entered Havana in January 1959, the euphoria of victory masked a harsher reality: the revolution needed consolidation. Armies may crumble, but their officers, police, and informants remain. For Che Guevara, this was not a moment for hesitation. He was placed in charge of La Cabana, an 18th-century fortress overlooking Havana's harbor, now repurposed as a prison and tribunal center. For 5 months, Guevara oversaw revolutionary tribunals charged with judging those linked to Batista's regime. Trials were swift. Former soldiers, police officers, and officials were accused of torture, murder, and collaboration. Some received prison sentences, others execution by firing squad. Witnesses recall Guevara attending sessions, reading dossiers, and in some cases personally authorizing the sentences. The numbers remain debated. Conservative estimates put executions at La Cabana around 176, while other sources suggest higher figures. To supporters, these were war criminals finally facing justice. To critics, they were victims of summary trials. Guevara defended the process as revolutionary necessity, insisting that justice delayed would encourage counter-revolt. The tribunals became one of the most polarizing episodes of his life. For some Cubans, La Cabana symbolized accountability after years of dictatorship. For others, it foreshadowed the severity of the new order. And at the center of it all stood the Argentine doctor who had traded medicine for power. Yet Guevara's role extended far beyond the prison. By late 1959, Castro's government needed educated administrators, and Guevara, well-read, disciplined, and trusted, was appointed to key posts. He became head of the National Bank of Cuba, signing the country's currency simply as Che. Soon after, he was named Minister of Industries, charged with transforming Cuba's economy along socialist lines. He approached these positions with ideological zeal. He advocated centralized planning, collectivized agriculture, and rapid industrialization modeled on Soviet examples. The goal was to reduce dependence on sugar exports and diversify into manufacturing. But the results were uneven. Bureaucracy slowed production, incentives for efficiency disappeared, and ambitious targets were missed. Farmers resisted collectivization, workers struggled under rigid directives. By 1960, Cuba's difficulties deepened. The United States imposed a trade embargo, cutting off markets and vital supplies. Washington's hostility pushed Havana closer to Moscow. Guevara became a key negotiator with the Soviet Union, securing oil, machinery, and military aid in exchange for sugar. But reliance on the USSR came at a price. The Cuban economy was increasingly tethered to sugar exports, the very dependence Guevara had vowed to escape. Factories fell short, harvests faltered, and rationing became routine. Guevara, however, remained steadfast. He wrote essays condemning capitalist profit motives and calling for the new man, workers motivated by revolutionary consciousness rather than material rewards. Still, his dual legacy in this period is striking. On one side, he established literacy campaigns, supported universal health care, and promoted education programs that reached rural areas ignored under Batista. On the other, he presided over executions, rigid economic policies, and ideological experiments that strained Cuba's fragile resources. It is here that the contradictions in his character sharpen. Was Che Guevara the healer, bringing education and health to the poor, or the executioner, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing dissent with death? At Tale of History, we present these contradictions with evidence. Was Che the doctor who saved lives, or the commander who took them? Comment below with your view. History is remembered in debate as much as in documents. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more deep explorations like this. By 1961, Guevara's speeches and essays projected confidence, but cracks were visible. Cuba's economy remained dependent, living standards stagnated, and the regime grew more authoritarian. The solution, in Guevara's mind, was not retreat but escalation. That escalation came in 1962, during the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, eager to secure an ally close to American shores, secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The discovery sparked a 13-day standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Castro and his government, including Guevara, were caught in the middle of negotiations between Washington and Moscow. The crisis ended when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. guarantees not to invade Cuba and a secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey. Publicly, the crisis was hailed as a victory for diplomacy. Privately, Guevara expressed fury. To a British journalist, he later remarked that it was a great pity the missiles had not remained, insisting that Cuba would have fired them at the United States if given the chance. It was a glimpse into his uncompromising worldview, a man willing to risk nuclear conflict in pursuit of revolutionary struggle. And it marked the beginning of a divide between Guevara's hardline ideology and Castro's more pragmatic strategy. The missiles were withdrawn, the world stepped back from the edge, but Guevara's fury grew. He began to look beyond Cuba's shores, convinced that the revolution at home was only the beginning. His next stage would be international, and far more perilous. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Guevara's disillusionment with global politics deepened. While Castro moved toward pragmatic alignment with the Soviet Union, Che demanded something different, a relentless expansion of revolution across continents. From 1963 onward, Guevara became Cuba's most visible internationalist. He toured Algeria, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and the United Arab Republic, forging ties with leaders who sought to break free of colonial and neo-colonial structures. In Algeria, he praised the country's recent independence war as proof that guerrilla struggle could triumph against superior armies. He also traveled to China and North Korea, where he observed different socialist models. Beijing's emphasis on peasant-led revolution impressed him, reinforcing his belief that the rural poor, not urban elites, were the engine of change. Yet his admiration for China widened the gap with Moscow, whose model of bureaucratic socialism he criticized as self-serving. In his speeches, Guevara repeated a single theme: imperialism must be confronted everywhere. At the 1966 Tricontinental Conference in Havana, his message was uncompromising: create many Vietnams. His argument was that only by multiplying conflicts could the United States and its allies be overstretched and weakened. Meanwhile, Guevara refined his theory of guerrilla war. His book Guerrilla Warfare, first published in 1961, set out rules for insurgency. A small committed force could defeat larger armies by embedding itself in rural populations, waging attrition, and embodying discipline. It was both a manual and a manifesto, designed for circulation among revolutionaries worldwide. Yet his writings revealed tension between theory and practice. He warned that guerrilla warfare could not succeed without genuine popular support. But he also implied that such support could be generated through armed example, even when absent at the start. This contradiction would later haunt his campaigns. Inside Cuba, his positions grew increasingly controversial. Castro and the Soviet Union prioritized survival of the Cuban state, not global confrontation. Guevara, however, accused both superpowers of exploiting developing nations, the U.S. through direct dominance, and the USSR through economic manipulation. In a 1965 speech in Algiers, he denounced the Soviet Union for trading with the Third World on unequal terms, calling it complicity with imperialism. 5. The clash was stark. To many observers, it seemed only a matter of time before Guevara and Castro diverged. At Tale of History, we examine these fractures with evidence. Do you think Guevara's vision of global revolution was idealistic brilliance or reckless fantasy? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into moments where ideology and reality collide. By early 1965, Guevara disappeared from public view. Castro later announced that he had left Cuba to spread revolution abroad. His first destination was Africa, where he believed the struggle against colonialism could ignite a wider upheaval. But Guevara's first mission outside Cuba revealed the limits of theory. In the jungles of the Congo, far from Havana, his internationalism would be tested by mistrust, logistical chaos, and the quiet hand of the CIA. In 1965, Che Guevara traveled secretly to the Congo, hoping to aid leftist rebels fighting the Western-backed government. He believed Africa could become the next great front of revolution. He brought with him Cuban fighters, supplies, and his own reputation. But conditions were nothing like the Sierra Maestra. The Congolese factions were fragmented, discipline was weak, and language barriers made coordination nearly impossible. Guevara's diaries describe his frustration: local commanders neglected patrols, abandoned positions, and lacked supplies. Disease and poor logistics crippled the mission. Worse, the CIA monitored events closely, eager to contain Cuban involvement. After 7 months, Guevara conceded failure. In his diary, he wrote that he was leaving with the bitter taste of defeat. His African campaign had produced no uprising, no spark. He returned to Latin America, determined to try again. In 1966, Guevara slipped into Bolivia under false identity. His aim was to build a guerrilla foco, a nucleus that could expand into continental revolution. Bolivia, landlocked and impoverished, seemed ripe for insurgency. Yet from the start, conditions worked against him. The Bolivian Communist Party, aligned with Moscow, refused to support his mission, viewing him as reckless. Local peasants, wary of outsiders, withheld trust. Without popular backing, Guevara's small group of Cuban and Bolivian fighters was isolated. His asthma worsened in the rugged terrain, yet he pressed on. The Bolivian army, trained by U.S. advisors and aided by CIA operatives, tracked the guerrillas relentlessly. One by one, rebel detachments were ambushed or forced to retreat. In his Bolivian diary, Guevara recorded the mounting despair. Dwindling food, exhausted fighters, and growing awareness that survival was unlikely. Still, he clung to principle. On October 7, 1967, he wrote, "The situation is very critical. Our efforts have been worth it, even if we fail." His words showed both defiance and resignation, a commander aware of the closing trap. The following day, October 8, his group was encircled near La Higuera. Mortars and machine guns raked the hillside. Guevara was wounded in the leg and captured alive. His attempt to ignite Latin America's revolution had ended in a small Bolivian village. Now a prisoner, Che Guevara would face interrogation, debate in the highest circles of power, and finally a death staged to look accidental. His last hours would seal his transformation from man to myth. Che Guevara's capture electrified Bolivia and alarmed Washington. The Bolivian army, under orders from President René Barrientos, quickly decided there would be no trial. A living Guevara could become a platform for revolutionary rhetoric. On October 9, 1967, he was held in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera. Soldiers and officers came to glimpse the prisoner who had become a global symbol. Accounts say he was calm, chain-smoking, and refusing to beg. The CIA favored further interrogation, but Bolivian leadership wanted closure. The order was given: execution. Sergeant Mario Terán was selected to carry it out. Terrified, he drank heavily before entering the classroom. Witnesses recalled Guevara's final words: "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Terán fired, first hitting his arms and legs, then his chest. Guevara fell, dead at 39. The Bolivian military sought to display proof. His body was flown to Valle Grande, washed, and laid out on a hospital sink for journalists and locals to see. Photographs taken that day, Guevara's eyes open, his face serene, were immediately compared to religious iconography. To prevent his grave from becoming a shrine, the Bolivian army buried his body secretly in an unmarked pit. It remained hidden for 3 decades, until 1997, when forensic teams located the remains. They were returned to Cuba, where a state funeral honored him as a martyr. The press in 1967 reported his death worldwide. For supporters, it was confirmation of sacrifice. For opponents, it was the end of a dangerous agitator. Yet the image of his corpse, circulated across newspapers and later posters, immortalized him. This moment shows how images can outlive events. Do photographs shape memory more than words? Tell us below, and subscribe to Tale of History if you believe history deserves to be remembered in all its complexity. His death closed one chapter. But his image, captured in a single photograph, opened another, one that turned Che Guevara from revolutionary into global icon. Che Guevara's life ended in a Bolivian schoolhouse, but his image began a new journey. The photograph by Alberto Corda. Head tilted, eyes fixed on a distant horizon, became one of the most reproduced portraits in history. Printed on posters, flags, and T-shirts, it detached Guevara from the blood and complexity of his record. For revolutionaries, he remained an emblem of defiance, a martyr who fought imperialism to his last breath. Guerrilla movements across Latin America, Africa, and Asia cited his writings and carried his likeness into battle. For critics, the same image represented violence, authoritarianism, and reckless ideology. They pointed to the executions at La Cabana and his willingness to risk nuclear war as evidence of ruthlessness. Historians continue to debate his place. Was he a visionary committed to justice, or a dogmatist blind to human cost? The answer lies in the contradiction: a doctor who killed, a commander who wrote of solidarity, a man who demanded sacrifice yet inspired hope. Thank you for watching Tale of History. Like, subscribe, and share this video to keep these stories alive, and join us for our next deep exploration of the past. Che Guevara died a man. He lived on as a symbol. And symbols, unlike men, do not die.